Our next speaker, Betsy Wieseman, is curator of Dutch and Flemish paintings from 1600 to 1800 at the National Gallery in London. She received her doctorate from Columbia University with a dissertation on the 17th century Dutch painter Caspar Netscher. She joined the National Gallery in 2006 from the Cincinnati Art Museum, where she was curator of European painting and sculpture. Previously, Betsy had held curatorial posts at the Allen Memorial Art Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Among the exhibitions that she has curated are Rembrandt, The Late Works at the National Gallery and Rijksmuseum, Vermeer and Music, The Art of Love and Leisure, also at the National Gallery, Vermeer's Women, Secrets and Silence at the Fitzwilliam, and in 2004, she co-curated the exhibition Drawn by the Brush, the oil sketches of Peter Paul Rubens. That was in Greenwich, Cincinnati, and Berkeley. Future projects include an exhibition on Peter Paul Rubens' work in London and a study on the 19th century English Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel as a collector of Dutch and Flemish paintings. Today, Betsy will talk to us about collecting Rubens. Please welcome her to the stage.
Thank you, Inge, for the lovely introduction. And also, as with the other speakers, I'd like to extend my thanks to you and to Esme and to Samantha and the remainder of the staff here at the Frick for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm delighted to have the opportunity of talking about Rubens paintings and the wonderful collections of Rubens paintings here in America. And when I was asked to compile this short little bio, I made sure that it, you did understand that I do have some experience dealing with Flemish paintings in this country, that I'm not, just looking at this from an external perspective. Nearly all of the papers presented during this symposium have touched or will touch on the art of Peter Paul Rubens, and rightly so, because he's probably the best known, most prolific, and arguably the most dynamic figure in the history of Flemish painting. Yet historically, he has been one of the most problematic artists for Americans to come to terms with. Indeed, this suave and successful artist-cum-diplomat represents much of what the country's original Puritan settlers and colonial founders had so determinedly rejected when they turned their backs on Europe for the New World. Rubens respected kings and rulers. He was a devout and committed Catholic. He was unabashedly erudite, and his lush, freely painted compositions openly celebrated the opulent and the sensual. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that Rubens's reputation was for long periods eclipsed in a nation guided by Protestant, democratic, and Republican ideals. Most American collectors found works by Rubens's contemporaries more palatable, Teniers' scenes of country folk in taverns and landscapes, or Van Dyck's elegant and refined portraits, which, as Adam laid out for us in yesterday's presentation, so perfectly satisfied the ancestral aspirations of wealthy entrepreneurs. Another hurdle for would-be collectors and connoisseurs of Rubens's work in America was access to original paintings. Major works were securely lodged in churches and princely galleries across Europe. Moreover, the enormous number of lesser quality works by Rubens's workshop and followers made, and indeed still makes, attribution and guarantees of authenticity an extraordinarily complicated issue. My paper today will look briefly at some of the highs and lows in the history of collecting and appreciating Rubens's paintings in America, and explore perhaps some reasons why this history has been so fraught. For expediency, I've limited myself to paintings in public collections in the United States, and for the most part to acquisitions and events before the 1970s. In considering American collectors' acquisitions of paintings by Rubens in the Gilded era of the late 19th and early 20th century, one has the distinct impression that acquisitions were made primarily to tick the requisite box on a list of great painters every self-respecting public or private collection ought to have. For example, when the Metropolitan Museum of Art opened in early 1872, it displayed an eclectic group of 174 European paintings that had been rather hastily assembled the year before, including a work by, or at least purported to be by, Peter Paul Rubens. And in the slides that I'll be showing you, down at the bottom, I indicate the year in which it was acquired by the museum, just so you have that as reference. The painting, frankly and understandably, baffled one critic who visited the museum's opening in February 1872, and I quote, "The most striking among the principal works is undoubtedly is The Return of the Holy Family by Peter Paul Rubens, which formerly belonged to the museum at Brussels. The canvas has apparently been cut, and the work is so strikingly unequal in merit that we may well doubt whether the figure of Joseph is not by a less skillful hand than that of Rubens. The figure and countenance of Mary, too, are commonplace, but the expression on the face of the child Jesus is so surpassingly beautiful as he turns his head to look up at his mother." I'm not sure I would exactly agree with the division of beauty versus awkwardness in that painting. The Rubens paintings collected by Thomas Jefferson Bryan, as Margaret explained to us yesterday, for his Gallery of Christian Art and displayed at the New York Historical Society from 1867, presented casual viewers and would-be students of the Flemish painter with an even greater difficulties in trying to come to an understanding of his art. One reviewer, writing in 1877, admitted that the Bryan Rubenses were perhaps not so great as those in the Met, but were more interesting, quote, "as far as instruction is concerned." This presumably because, as the reviewer stated, Mr. Bryan made a point of getting all the paintings of this brilliant genius on which he could lay his hands. 9 pictures give more or less accurate account of his scope and style. Of these 9 paintings, at least 3 were openly acknowledged to be copies, but 5 paintings were deemed by Bryan and the experts whom he consulted to be genuine. One of these was the St. Catherine, which, according to the reviewer, quote, "while it has the type of face often seen in Rubens's pictures, it is remarkable for the stiffness of the hands of the saint." A painting of Christ bearing the cross, which there's the St. Catherine and there's the Christ bearing the cross, was deemed extraordinary, albeit in poor condition, and, quote, "quite sure to offend all but the hardened examiner of religious pictures." Not because of the bold and startling drawing, apparently, but mostly because of the vivid gout of blood that spurted freely from Christ's side to land in a chalice standing before him, which was perhaps just too literal a rendering of the Eucharistic sacrament to make Protestant Americans entirely comfortable. The largest painting given to Rubens in the Bryan collection was a picture of Hercules strangling the Nemean lion. While the reviewer hesitated to ascribe the execution of the painting to the hand of the master, he judged it could well have been made in his workshop. And he said, "The picture as it stands has much magnificence. It is so bold and broad in drawing that one is loath to attribute the underlying sketch to any hand less fierce and powerful than that of Rubens." In exhibiting this range of works, large and small, portraits, landscapes, religious and historical scenes, copies, and collaborations, it can fairly be said that the Bryan collection did offer the visitor much that was interesting and instructive about the diversity and complexity surrounding the production of Rubens's atelier, if not that of the master himself. Not every Rubens painting on view in America presented the would-be connoisseur with such difficulties, however. As we've seen, in 1889, the first securely attributed painting by Rubens to enter an American public collection, Rubens and Studio, The Meeting of David and Abigail of about 1625 to 28, was acquired by the Detroit Institute of Arts as a gift from James Scripps. In 1902, the Met acquired the Holy Family with Saints Francis and Anne and the infant St. John the Baptist as a gift from James Henry Smith, and they added the Wolf and Fox Hunt in 1910. Still, the many optimistic attributions of works in public collections made it difficult for even the most assiduous students to come to terms with Rubens's art, and the path was not aided greatly by the few books on Rubens's that were available in English. And Arthur yesterday mentioned those by Calvert and Kenyon Cox. There were also European publications such as Émile Michel's monograph on the artist, which was translated into English in 1899, but understandably did not discuss any works then in American collection. American writers appear to have been a bit indecisive or ambivalent about whether they loved or hated Rubens's work. And I'm quoting here from a book written by John Lafarge in 1903. He says about Rubens, he had the supreme advantage of having a taste whose deficiencies met the ordinary taste of the day. I'm not quite sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. In our own time, we feel the redundancy and inflation of much of his work, especially in arrangement or ornament, and sometimes a similar defect in his compositions. But wherever that may be in his painting, there is some balance of color and of light redeems the heaviness of form, incorrectness of drawing, and confusion of attitudes. So, yeah, I still don't know what he thinks about Rubens, whether he's good or bad. And I imagine many of his readers were similarly confused. Nonetheless, by the second decade of the 20th century, the number of works in America by or attributed to Rubens was growing steadily. In 1914, the arch-Rubens apologist Willem Valentiner published a broadly chronological survey of works by the master in public and private collections. He introduced his essay by stating that he had seen in American collections about 40 of Rubens's pictures, some 20 of them sketches, and most of them unpublished. He complained that while the great private collections of America long since admitted Van Dyck, they opened their doors more hesitatingly to this great master. The exceptions that he cited included Mrs. Gardiner, who had only one portrait, although it's a pretty fine one, and of course the laudable collection of Mr. Johnson of Philadelphia, whose collection of Dutch and Flemish paintings, not incidentally, Valentiner had just catalogued the year before. Johnson had a special liking for Rubens's sketches, and by Valentiner's reckoning, owned about a quarter of all Rubens's paintings then in America. Valentiner's impartiality when it came to making positive attributions may be a bit suspect, but his obvious esteem for Rubens is hard to fault. He clearly shared Johnson's taste for the oil sketches and said, as in general the great collectors still show so little interest in Rubens, small examples are more numerous than large and finished pictures intended for a church or palace. But this is not a matter for regret to anyone who wishes to speak of them, for by common consent, Rubens's sketches reveal the very essence of his genius. The 350th anniversary of Rubens's birth in 1927 passed virtually unnoticed in this country, with just a modest exhibition at the gallery of New York dealer P. Jackson Higgs to mark the event. It was rather more effusively celebrated in Rubens's hometown of Antwerp, as you might imagine. A descriptive account of the Antwerp festivities published in the New York Times gives a fair indication of popular thinking at the time about the productions of the Flemish master. It will be a grand occasion for the fundamentalists of the art world who like Rubens's magnification of saints, his full-rounded virgins and fat cherubs, who like their pictures done with power and on a generous scale, crowded with flesh, foliage, and color, embroidered with vines, fig trees, peacocks, clouds of cupids, and not too concerned with ideas. Magnificent his descent from the cross has been called, and devoid of anything approaching true piety. Anyone who knows anything about painting could name half a dozen religious painters who knew less of the technicalities of painting than he, and yet got more of true piety in their work. Perhaps the modern world is too far removed from Rubens's day to be deeply stirred by his billowy figures of the Virgin. Certainly, some of the far-fetched allegories have lost their meaning. What the layman sees is heat and exuberance, sheer pictorial power, true and careful drawing, bold coloring. Yet the painter's lack of spiritual qualities is almost universally felt. Technique aside, Rubens's chief strength seems to have been in his sensuous enjoyment of physical life and his remarkably wide knowledge both of antiquity and of the world of his day. For Americans in the 1920s, it seems, Rubens was the master showman, capable of impressive flash and spectacle, but shallow and difficult to connect with on a personal level. Predictably, perhaps, it took a master showman to give the artist his due in true American fashion. In the spring of 1926, the circus impresario's real estate speculator and energetic art collector John Ringling made his first trip to Europe, accompanied by the Munich art dealer Julius Böhler. Ringling had met Böhler a few years previously, about the same time as he began thinking of establishing a museum in Sarasota as an intended gift for the people of Florida. Coupled with a school of visual art, the museum would present representative examples from important periods and schools of European painting and sculpture to inspire and educate students and visitors. With Böhler by his side, Ringling began shopping in earnest. In 3 years of intense, rapid buying, he accumulated the greater part of his art collection, including more than 300 paintings. Although his collection was far-ranging, Ringling entertained a distinct and then rather unfashionable interest in large-scale Baroque art. Art that was, after all, with its rich drama and pageantry, not unlike the dynamic, exuberant, and colorful world of the circus. The similarity between the art that Ringling collected and his main profession, or more precisely, the unusual aptitude of a circus magnate for creating an art museum, was noted in an Art News article in 1928. The number of men who are both active as heads of art museums and circuses is somewhat limited, I would imagine. Pitfalls there may be, but there are also many points of contact, and the gift of showmanship, the energy, the vitality, the enthusiasm which has made the circus thrilling are excellent qualifications for the man who would meet the old masters on familiar terms. Of course, the single most spectacular of Ringling's purchases were these 4 enormous paintings for the Triumph of the Eucharist tapestry series, which had been commissioned by the Archduchess Isabella Clara Eugenia for the convent of the Discalced Carmelites in Madrid in the 1620s. The Duke of Westminster had tried to sell the cartoons at auction in London 2 years earlier, but oddly found no takers for the 14-foot tall works. Ringling gladly paid over the odds for these enormous paintings and constructed a gallery in his new museum specifically to house them, together with 2 tapestries from the same series, and an additional cartoon from the Eucharist series was acquired by the Ringling Museum in 1980. Much like Rubens himself, Ringling orchestrated the entire space in which the paintings were to be seen. Impressive new frames were ordered for the pictures, decorative moldings in the room's cornices echoed the garlands hoisted by the putti within the paintings themselves. In addition to the Triumph of the Eucharist cartoons, Ringling purchased 5 other paintings by or attributed to Rubens for his museum between 1926 and 1930. The fine points of authorship, specifically the degree of studio participation, evidently troubled Ringling no more than it did Rubens. What mattered most, and what he so admirably achieved, was the brilliance of the overall effect of the finished result. Despite John Ringling's zeal, it cannot be said that his spectacular gathering of Rubens paintings had an immediate, transformative impact on the taste for Rubens's art in America. In fact, the Ringling Museum opened in 1932 with more of a whimper than a bang, crippled by Ringling's drastic financial reversals as a result of the Great Depression and his death just a few years later. Only in 1946 did the museum reopen under state administration and with the equally flamboyant and theatrical Chick Austin as director. Nonetheless, perhaps the well-publicized stories of Ringling's Rubensian scaled purchases did have some impact, for acquisitions of Rubens paintings by museums throughout the country increased steadily from the late 1920s onwards. Among the notable Rubenses acquired during the period of the 1930s and 40s are the four paintings you see here. And trust me, it's always difficult to select just a few representative works, the Venus and Adonis, the Tribute Money from San Francisco, and two beautiful paintings from the MFA in Boston. And then in terms of oil sketches, the fantastic painting from the Art Institute of Chicago and the Neptune Calming the Tempest from the Harvard Art Museums, which I also wanted to introduce just to note that it's also during the 30s and 40s, particularly the 40s, that a lot of smaller examples of paintings by Rubens start entering academic art museums. By the mid-1940s, so many works by Rubens had entered America, in part as a consequence of the war, that Valentiner felt compelled to revisit his essay on American collections written more than 30 years earlier. In an article in the Art Quarterly published in 1946, he was able to list 142 paintings by Rubens in America, although he admitted that, quote, many of the listed paintings are still in the hands of New York dealers and cannot actually be called, as yet, American possessions. But the likelihood is that only very few of these paintings will go back to Europe. They would not have been brought over if there was not a demand for them. While sometimes Valentiner erred on the side of generosity in attributing works to Rubens's hand, another nearly simultaneous publication surveying Rubens's work in America was a bit more restrictive. In 1947, Jan Albert Goris and Julius Held's book on the artist appeared, including drawings as well as paintings. By this time, the number of Rubens' works in America had increased to the point where it is possible and advisable for a scholar like Held to segregate the more secure attributions from the murkier pretenders. Accordingly, the catalog is divided between accepted works, which include 95 paintings and 31 drawings, and more questionable attributions, which include 90 paintings and 16 drawings. If the second quarter of the 20th century had seen a sharp rise in the number of Rubens paintings in America, it was nothing compared to the explosion of acquisitions of his works in the 1950s and 60s. Putting exact figure to the number entering collections is tricky, as there's always a gray area regarding authorship, but I would estimate over 40 paintings plausibly attributed to Rubens or to Rubens with some degree of studio participation entered American public collections during these 2 decades. And among the more spectacular acquisitions are these, and in terms of oil sketches, these lovely paintings as well. It's clear that by the mid-20th century, American museums were happily committed to affording Rubens a central role in their presentation of the history of Western European painting. As the number of Rubens paintings in America increased, so inevitably did the likelihood of encountering multiple versions of the same composition in different collections. In 1931, the San Diego Museum of Art acquired the workshop version, or Rubens in workshop version, of a painting that had been in the Met's collection since 1902. While Valentiner gave his preference to the San Diego picture, Held gave his preference to the New York picture, and demoted the San Diego one as a studio variant, which included some modifications which are, quote, not to the advantage of the picture. In the 1950s, the Met and LACMA each acquired a version of an early work by Rubens, The Holy Family with the Dove. The Los Angeles picture is significantly larger, 5.5 feet tall to the Met's 2 feet tall. The Met painting is commonly considered to be an exceptionally finished modello for the Los Angeles picture, although there's still some question about its role, and I think it's a good example of how our understanding of Rubens's production and his working process is still a matter of research interest. There are a number of other instances of duplicates, replicas, and studio versions spread across American collections. Usually these pass under the radar and rarely come to the attention of the American public. However, these sorts of debates do excite a little bit more public interest when a downgraded attribution is the subject of a lawsuit, involves huge sums of money and/or A-list personalities. And this was the case with two versions of Diana and the Nymphs departing for the hunt, one acquired by the Cleveland Museum in 1959, and the other by multimillionaire tycoon and collector J. Paul Getty in 1961, and now lurking in the Getty Museum. Potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars were at stake in authenticating one painting over the other, and well-known scholars lined up on both sides of the fence. The story even merited a spread in Life magazine in February 1962, which invited readers to try and decide for themselves which of the two paintings was most likely to be by Rubens. A subsequent issue a couple of weeks later published some letters from readers weighing in on the matter, one of which will probably seem hideously familiar to any museum curator. I don't know how many of you curators also get letters by concerned twitchers. It hardly seems right to end on this contentious note, especially as so many great paintings by Rubens have entered public collections in the United States over the past 40 years or so. And again, I just show you a very restricted selection of paintings and of oil sketches, all of which entered public collections in the 1970s into the 21st century. Still, despite the presence of so many beautiful and authentic works by Rubens in public collections across the United States, a century and a half after museum goers were first exposed to his work on their native soil, Rubens still remains a tough sell. A review of the Age of Rubens Exhibition in the 1990s had the following to say: nothing, recounts the exhibition, concludes, nothing can obscure the larger paradox of Rubens himself. It's easy to admire his lusciously bravura art with all its astonishing inventiveness. He could paint the sensuous stuff of the world like nobody's business: satin, fur, marble, atmosphere, and, most of all, flesh and blood. And he could manipulate pictorial space to uncanny effect, inventing eye-popping labyrinths of figures and whirlwinds of flashing light. But it's awfully hard to really love this stuff. I would hope that many of us would dispute that, and I can't come to a conclusion of the story of collecting Rubens in America, because I hope that it is an ongoing story and that there are many new works out there that can hopefully be added to American public collections and private collections. Thank you.